Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage was on Capitol Hill today to testify about spending for foreign assistance programs. This House Appropriations Subcommittee is chaired by Arizona Congressman Jim Colby, and the hearing runs about 2 hours, 20 minutes.
Good morning. The Subcommittee on Foreign Operations will come to order. Secretary Armitage, we're very happy to have you with us here today to talk about the President's request for emergency supplemental funds for fiscal year 2002 and talk about them for the programs that are under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, as well as to talk about the fiscal year 2003 request for assistance to the frontline states. So our hearing this morning is on those two topics, both the supplemental and the frontline states in the 2003 budget. It's been just over 7 months since the attacks against the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon here in Washington. Congress has already provided $40 billion to the President in response to those events, and we're now preparing to respond to a second major request that totals $27.1 billion to support the war on terrorism and provide money for homeland security and economic revitalization. But this request includes $1.279 billion for international affairs program that comes under the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. In addition, the fiscal year 2003 budget request includes increased assistance to many of our allies who are with us in this war against terrorism. While much of the focus of this hearing is going to be on the supplemental request, we need to remember that the fiscal year 2003 budget we will be addressing next month also contains considerable funding for the same purposes, and hence it's advisable for us to consider this all together here today. On March 11th, the President marked the 6-month anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks in a speech that included the following comment, quote, "We face an enemy of ruthless ambition, unconstrained by law or morality. Against such an enemy, there is no immunity, and there can be no neutrality," unquote. I agree with those remarks of the President, and I agree that this war against terrorism is not finished, and no one can say for certain that the terrorists will not attempt to strike again here in the United States someplace. We cannot act alone in this effort, and that is why the request for international affairs program is just as important in its own way as the much larger part of this request that the President has made for defense activities. We need to provide security and military assistance to our friends and allies in this war because they are putting their lives of their soldiers and citizens on the line just as we are doing every day. In addition, we need to provide many of them with the economic assistance that they need to continue to work towards the rule of law, to economic reform, all of which can provide a brighter future for their people. Poverty and hopelessness do not necessarily generate terrorism, but they certainly can provide the conditions under which it becomes more likely, conditions that provide a more fertile soil for terrorism to grow in. The Congress has already given the President generous funding and legal authority as he conducts the war on terrorism. However, as we move forward, we cannot abdicate our constitutional responsibilities as caretakers of the taxpayers' dollars. In that regard, we appreciate this opportunity to hear from the distinguished Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Richard Armitage, regarding the details of this request. I think I can say, Mr. Secretary, for all the members of this subcommittee, that any skeptical questions that you might hear today from us do not indicate in any way a lack of a commitment to a common goal that we all share in this war against terrorism, but only a desire to make sure that we are making the best possible use of the taxpayers' funds. And one of the things that I would hope that in your opening remarks, or certainly in our questions, that we will address is the issue of defining the frontline states. This is, as we know, a constantly shifting description, as well it should be, flexible. But I think it's important for us to know how the administration looks at this issue and what states would be defined as frontline states. And with that, let me stop and give the floor to my distinguished ranking member, Ms. Lowy, and ask her for her opening statement. Ms. Lowy.
And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to join the chairman in welcoming Deputy Secretary Armitage to our hearing. And I want to particularly thank you, Mr. Secretary, for keeping me and this committee informed of this administration's actions. It's very much appreciated, and I want you to know that. Your timely calls really do make a difference, and I thank you very much. The events of September 11th require that we take a new approach to our foreign assistance programs, reflected in the administration's request for $1.3 billion in emergency funding for a wide variety of initiatives. I'm gratified that we have now achieved a broad consensus that our foreign assistance programs are vital to the national security interests of the United States. I hope this recognition, which I have long sought, will help steer more resources to all aspects of our foreign aid programs. It is long overdue. In that spirit, Mr. Secretary, I'll begin by expressing my support for the vast majority of items requested in the supplemental for emergency funding. We have clearly embarked on a new path that will involve greater focus on military and security assistance programs coupled with economic assistance. This new direction puts a special responsibility on the Defense Department to carry out programs while respecting congressional directives and restrictions. While I support most of the initiatives in this request, I strongly caution the administration not to expect blanket waivers of all existing restrictions and law in the name of combating terrorism. Specifically, I'm concerned that supplemental requests for ESF, FMF, peacekeeping, and non-proliferation accounts totaling over $1 billion contain notwithstanding any other provision of law clauses consistently. This request also applies to all previously appropriated funds in these accounts. The explanatory material sent to Congress contains no justification for these actions, Mr. Secretary, so if there are specific concerns about existing restrictions on specific countries, I would encourage you to address them here today. We'll work with you, but Congress should not and will not grant this type of broad waiver. With respect to Colombia, as a follow-up to last week's hearing, I'm pleased that the administration is working with the Colombians on severing links with paramilitary organizations. However, as far as I know, the Colombians have yet to take the specific steps we requested that they take. Obtaining that cooperation is vital to achieving the consensus in Congress that will be necessary to approve a broadening of our commitment there. I would also appreciate a clarification from you on the expanded authorities sought in your request. As submitted, the language contains a broad, again, notwithstanding clause with specific exemptions for human rights vetting requirements and U.S. manpower limits. Therefore, if approved as requested, the requirements included in the FY 2002 bill on severing of links with paramilitaries, Section 567, reporting on the safety of aerial fumigation, and notifying Congress on resumption of the air bridge operations will all be removed. I hope this was not the administration's intent, and I would ask that you address this concern in your remarks. The supplemental request also contains language in the DoD section authorizing the use of $100 million in DoD resources for military assistance to foreign countries and $30 million for indigenous forces. Although DoD has attempted to play down the significance of this, the fact remains that it would be a considerable sum with wide open authority for military assistance to any country without input from Congress or the State Department. The Foreign Operations Subcommittee has jurisdiction over these programs, and as far as I know, the State Department still has the primary role in setting foreign policy priorities. Let me reiterate that most members of Congress are willing to work with the administration and support necessary resources with appropriate flexibility, which will include a substantial increase in foreign military financing. But this proposal and the cavalier manner in which it was put forward by the President erodes the premise that the administration is seeking that type of partnership. Another specific concern I have is the request for $8 million for training and equipping a domestic peacekeeping force in Indonesia. Current law prohibits military assistance to Indonesia, and this appears to be an attempt to circumvent these restrictions by assisting the military, couching the proposal as peacekeeping. In addition, recent press reports have characterized Indonesia's cooperation with us in the war on terrorism as extremely poor. Apparently, they've been unwilling to cooperate in efforts to locate and apprehend known associates of Osama bin Laden residing in Indonesia. Given the administration's continued inability to certify that the conditions for resumption of military assistance have been met and the absence of cooperation on terrorism from Indonesia, I see no reason to go forward with this program. While I know this issue lies outside the scope of the subcommittee's formal mandate, I want to take this opportunity to express some concerns I have about the direction of our policy toward Afghanistan. I strongly support the war on terrorism, Mr. Secretary. I believe that defeating terror in the long term will require a prolonged effort from the United States, and that is why I'm concerned about the timidity I believe our country is showing in Afghanistan right now. While most of the big military battles may be over, the war for Afghanistan's future has just begun, as you well know, and winning it will take a sustained, substantial commitment of U.S. assistance and personnel. The situation in Afghanistan right now, particularly outside of Kabul, and our country's response to it does not bode well for the promise of stability and prosperity in that country. If we have time, I hope we can discuss this issue. Finally, Mr. Secretary, we welcome the President's announcement in Monterey that he would seek to increase resources for foreign assistance by $10 billion over 5 years. However, I was really disappointed that he has chosen to put off this effort until 2004. We have before us a request for $1.3 billion in emergency needs related to the war on terrorism. The fact that the President has already made a commitment to increase resources for other development programs indicates that he too recognizes that there are other emergency needs that require immediate attention. Waiting for the 2004 budget means that no impact from this commitment will be felt on the ground in poor countries for at least 2 years. Our chairman has just returned from Africa, having seen firsthand the ravages of HIV/AIDS there. Even with the additional resources available for HIV programs already in place, access to testing, counseling, and treatment for this disease remains unavailable in most rural areas, and infection rates are continuing to climb worldwide. Illiteracy rates in many countries in Africa remain well above 50% in many countries where there continues to be no access to basic education for the majority of children. As the continent still reels from the internal conflicts of the past decade, the battle for basic food security is still being fought day by day. The President has decided we need to do more, and I wholeheartedly agree. We all know the needs are vast, so let's begin today, not 2 years from now. This, too, is a matter of national security, and I look forward to your testimony, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lowy. Mr. Secretary, we're prepared to hear your opening statement. As always, of course, the full statement will be placed in the record if you would like to summarize the statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me assure you and Mrs. Lowy and all the members of the committee, we have a very rich understanding that all wisdom does not reside in the executive branch, and indeed I have a very rich understanding that there is a necessary and very creative tension that exists among the three branches of our government, and for good reason. The Founding Fathers were brilliant in that respect, so we can assure you we fully respect that. Mr. Chairman, you have a very happy witness in front of you today. I don't know actually who's happier, Secretary Powell because he's returned or Rich Armitage because Secretary Powell returned, but you've got a pretty happy guy here today. I realize very well that the patience of the subcommittee is in inverse proportion to the length of my opening remarks. So I'm going to just try to answer directly each of your questions as you raise them. I just simply want to say to the committee, subcommittee as a whole, first of all, thank you. I believe you've been great partners. That does not mean that we didn't tussle and wrestle a bit along the way, but you've been great partners in this creative tension between the executive and the legislative branch. And Secretary Powell, myself, our whole department is very grateful for that support and for the intellectual challenges that you raise along the way. They help us. Second, I particularly want to thank the chairman. I can remember an evening I caught you in your district, sir. I was at a Georgetown basketball game.
That's right.
And I asked you if you could find your way clear to go to Kabul and to go to Islamabad. And you said you'd do it because I felt we needed members out there to see what was going on, see really on the ground. I know you met Secretary Powell in Islamabad during that trip, and I want to add a special thanks for that. And I'll just stand by and try to answer any questions the members may have.
Thank you. That certainly is one of the shorter statements that we've had on record, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted. I'm delighted. I think there's no doubt about the answer to your question of who's happier. Secretary Powell's happier because he's not up here in front of the committee, and not testifying in front of congressional committees is always the most sincere desire of members of any administration. Secretary, let me begin, and we're going to try. We have a number of members here, and more I think that will be coming in, and I'll probably take a lot of questions in a lot of areas, and so I'm going to try to keep our questions to the time limit here so that we can go back and forth as much as possible and give everybody an opportunity, and we'll just keep going with rounds of questions. We may well get interrupted by votes here very shortly here. I want to start with a question about Afghanistan. Ms. Lowy spoke about this issue as well. The funding request for Afghanistan in the supplemental is $250 million. Much of that is for the interim authority for training and equipping a new military for Afghanistan. And of that amount, $30 million would be provided to AID for reintegrating former combats into Afghan society, and another $40 million would be used for reconstruction and rehabilitation of activities. Those items that I just mentioned gives us a total of $70 million. And I think a case can be made that this is not sufficient given the amount of damage that has been caused by decades of war and ravaging of the violence in that region. My understanding is that AID did request a total of $150 million for its reconstruction activities in Afghanistan. I certainly don't always endorse what agencies go to OMB asking for, but I think in this case a good case can probably be made that additional funds are going to be needed. I don't think we're going to be in a position to add funds above the overall level requested by the President, but we may want to shift some of those funds around to provide a higher level for reconstruction activities in Afghanistan if indeed we decide that that is needed. So my question is twofold to you. One, just to ask for your general comments on the level of the supplemental funding level that's requested for AID reconstruction activities in Afghanistan. And second, the President's budget request for the next fiscal year for 2003 indicates that assistance for Afghanistan would be determined at a later date. Are you in a position now to share with us details of how that $138 million would be allocated for Afghanistan as part of the budget request?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're right there. Not only in Afghanistan, but in a number of areas, many different parts of our bureaucracy asked for a much enhanced level of funding. OMB was very strict because I believe they wanted to keep their credibility with you and with the Congress as a whole. They wanted to keep this directly as an O2 supplemental, something that is a shortfall in our O2 funding. Number two, as Mrs. Lowy correctly points out, the desire from OMB was that this money be truly emergency, therefore can be obligated before the end of this fiscal year, September 30th. That's one of the reasons that the numbers were generally down. More specifically on your comment about shifting monies around, Mr. Chairman, to more DA, we initially were very chary of too much development assistance, not because the need isn't huge, but because access to some areas of the country and security to those areas gave us some pause. and I wasn't sure myself that we could engage actively in a very robust DA program. We've had about a month since we put this together. I believe in some parts of the country conditions are changing, and that we ought to be able to work with the committee and with the staff, if that's your desire, to perhaps talk about a little different funding profile for developmental assistance. On the question of the 03 request, it is TBD. I've got the numbers. I think you have the same numbers, the 139. Let me make a few comments about what we're really trying to do here. We've got 2 months until we have the Loya Jirga. We're trying to simultaneously train an Afghan army of somewhere between 60 and 80,000, 60,000 soldiers, 12,000 border guards, and 6,000 of something else, or 8,000 troops of one sort or another. That's why we requested the FMF. That's why we request the $20 million in PKO funds to be able to pay the salaries of this army until we get rolling. This is something that our Department of Defense in the main will take on. We hope to start May 1. I'm not sure that we'll be able to. It's not entirely sure to me. And I think most of us who are involved in Afghanistan would say that the $138+ million that we're requesting in the 03 budget, whether it's in refugees and migration accounts or wherever, is short. It's short because we didn't credit the rapidity with which refugees would desire to return to Afghanistan. And frankly, we didn't credit the fact that that refugee or returning refugee population has become somewhat of a hotbed for dissatisfaction. And so I don't feel comfortable in putting my name next to the 03 numbers fully because I'm not sure we've settled out correctly, particularly in the refugee accounts and the migration accounts.
Mr. Secretary, then that's a new wrinkle, the way I hadn't heard before, that the funding level might actually be short if in the 03. Do you expect to either ask for an amendment or just to a reallocation of some of the, you're talking about, if you're talking about refugees, you're talking about a different account, the refugee account, is that correct?
Right.
And you would expect that more of these funds.
Well, I'm just pointing out to you my personal belief, and I think my department would certainly stand behind it, that we're short in that area. We didn't credit the amount of refugees and the returns, and we've got a lot of work to do. I think we're short in our overall refugee account.
And I had not heard about that numbers returning. For the record, perhaps the department could give us some figures about the return of refugees, the numbers that have actually returned in recent months, and the trends, the direction that it's going, and the expectations for that, the numbers that would be returning.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. Okay. Have to find my first question that I was going to ask you. Thank you again. Mr. Secretary, as I've indicated in my statement, I think we all agree that there's a humanitarian emergency in much of the world today that requires the United States to increase levels of assistance now, not 2004. A few questions, perhaps you can just answer them together. Given the President's commitment to this concept, first of all, why has the administration put off requesting new resources until 2004? Secondly, would you agree that this puts off the effects of these increased resources for 2 years? And with respect to HIV/AIDS, many are calling for additional resources for both the trust fund and bilateral programs. As programs move from prevention and awareness to counseling, testing, and treatment, it's clear more resources will be needed. What will the administration's position be if Congress adds more resources for HIV, and if you can deal with that together?
Well,
Thank you.
I'm trying to think how I can do yes, no, and maybe, but I can't quite answer the questions like that. First of all, the so-called Millennium account we're taking our time about getting into it because we're working out the criteria for the various countries, what Treasury and what State Department's roles will be in the allocation of these funds. We are intending this year in the 03 to have a pilot program probably in Africa, but we haven't even defined that yet. But that's kind of the intention, to see what works and what doesn't before we come forward with a rather large increase in our overall funding. On the question of, the second question was...
Putting off the resources for 2 years.
Well, it does, yes, it has that practical effect. I can
Right.
only say, in my defense, that if we get it right, then it's better than to go ahead in a hurry and not quite get it right, know what we're doing, and not have really reached out to all the Congress and explained ourselves articulately in just what these monies are for and how we intend to apply criteria and what countries are eligible, et cetera. But yes, it delays for 2 years. Finally, on the question of HIV/AIDS, anyone who opposes anything that assists and alleviates the scourge of this would be, in my view, wrong. I understand competing priorities, and I understand budget exigencies and things of that nature, but it's not just Africa. It's all through Russia. It's through Central Europe. This is a scourge that won't be stopped unless we lead the way. We are the leading donor in the world. But from the Department of State's point of view, if the Congress adds money, we'll use it well.
I won't pursue the putting it off till 2004, but I hope we can have further discussions about this, because I think we can get this money out much more quickly, and there is a crisis in the world, and I think we have an obligation to respond both in this regard in addition to the military. With regard to the Middle East, it's my understanding that among the many State Department requests for the supplemental that were not granted by OMB was a request for $200 million to help Israel with border and other national security priorities. In fact, I wondered, number one, on what basis did you recommend that the administration request $200 million in the supplemental for Israel? Do you consider Israel to be a frontline state in the war on terrorism? And do you believe that Israel currently has resources sufficient to meet the threats it currently faces, including the threat of a missile attack from Iraq?
I'm a little embarrassed to be discussing what is supposed to be internal deliberations of the executive branch, but it was so well publicized in the newspapers, I feel I must. Yes, we requested $200 million for Israel. It was, in the main, something that I felt and the department felt was a legacy from the evacuation of Lebanon. That we had there were discussions held in the then administration about this, and particularly for protection on the northern border, which Secretary Powell has recently spent so much time and energy on. And by the way, for the third day in a row, it has been relatively quiet, thank God. The decision to not go forward with that money was based on, I think, three things. First of all, the fact that Israel does receive $2.79 billion per year in rapid dispersing funds. Number two, that we've got a very robust program. We have supported the Arrow program with digital. I'm actually pleased to say I started it in the Department of Defense for the U.S., which tries to address the problem of missiles, particularly from Iraq. And three, when things come up sort of from time to time, we are able to respond with the help of the U.S. Congress. For instance, about 2 months ago, we came to the Congress, the DOD and state, with a request to be able to take DOD funds, bring them to state, to allow us to buy for the Israelis robotic EOD detection equipment to the tune of $29 million. So for all of those reasons, the decision was made not to put the money in this year, ma'am, in the emergency supplemental.
Thank you very much. I think my time has expired.
We'll come back.
Thank you.
Mr. Callahan.
Well, Mr. Secretary, first of all, I think this committee would share in the wisdom of its own self by saying to you and to the State Department and to the President, we're going to give you whatever resources you need to complete Operation Enduring Freedom. So when we question you, it doesn't mean that we're not supportive of what you're doing or the mission. But I do wonder, in reading your request, the definition of emergency funding and coupling it with the Operation Enduring Freedom, what Colombia has to do with that. I know that you have a bill that's coming up, and in addition to the money that you're requesting here for Colombia, in another section of this same supplemental, you're asking for $500 million more for Colombian assistance. I notice that you're asking for aid to Ecuador. And while I might support that, I have some questions about Ecuador, and I want you to respond about the Manta base to to question you as to whether or not we ought to condition the assistance to Ecuador with respect to the prohibition against American forces for using that base, which we paid millions of dollars to prepare and turn over to Ecuador, and yet they're telling us they're not going to allow us to use it for anything that has to do with Operation Enduring Freedom. So there's a question there. If this is for Operation Enduring Freedom, what is Ecuador doing there? If we're going to justify that, do you think we ought to condition it with the Manta base? Secondly, what is Colombia doing in this at this time under Operation Enduring Freedom? I mean, that's another war that we have, and maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. Mrs. Lowy touched on the fact that you didn't include any money for Israel, but certainly you've been here on Capitol Hill long enough to know that if you put 100 million, 200 million, 100 million in for Jordan, plus $28 million FMF, that somewhere during the process, Israel's going to get probably 5 or 6 times that amount of money. And then when Israel gets 5 or 6 times that amount of money, Egypt's going to come along and say, well, we're entitled to 2/3 of whatever Israel gets. So I don't know why we're including Jordan at this point, even though I support King Abdullah and I want to help him be a successful king. At the same time, I wonder what all this has to do with emergency funding, and is it about Operation Enduring Freedom, or is it just a supplemental to get your wish list that we didn't give to you for this fiscal year under the name of some emergency funding?
Mr. Callahan, I can assure you if it were a wish list, it would have been a lot more robust if I'd had my wish. I'll try to answer your question on Colombia, and particularly why this is, we're asking for the $35 million. We do believe this is part of the global war on terrorism. We know, and many of the members here know, that the FARC is targeting Americans, not just targeting officials and infrastructure in Colombia. Some of the money that we're requesting for Colombia, for instance, is specifically for anti-terrorist and anti-kidnap training. We've seen one of the candidates, Mr. Uribe, suffer his 12th assassination attempt in 2 years. I think I'd get out of the business if that's the kind of reception I got for 12 in 2 years. I think it's indicative of the size of the problem. On the question of Ecuador, Jordan, and then Ecuador, Jordan is a frontline state, both regarding in Iraq and with its cooperation, which she has given to us, sir, on the question of al-Qaeda. She has rendered people. She has with us and with our various agencies of our government, have broken up safe houses. We've gotten excellent cooperation getting into certain computer bases, computer files, et cetera. Jordan's been terrific. Been absolutely terrific. And I would argue they've also doing this in the face of a rather roiled population, given that the majority of Jordanians now are Palestinian in origin. They've been cooperating very closely on border security with Israel as well. In Ecuador, we believe we have got in the tri-border area a bit of a problem with al-Qaeda itself and some Hezbollah elements. And we do need cooperation, and frankly, we think we're afraid as we squeeze Colombia with hopefully the assistance and the support of the Congress, then like a balloon, some of the problems might balloon out in other areas, and we want to do what we can to try to keep Ecuador from ballooning out. On the question of the air base, I'm not informed of that, and I have to tell you that, and I have to get you a straight answer. So I'll take it and give it to you, sir.
Good. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Kilpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you again. I have a couple of questions. The new authority that's mentioned in the supplemental for the Defense Department, heretofore, State Department has been really charged with responsibility of foreign military financing and assistance. I know you two are brother organizations, sister organizations. What's the State Department's position on the new authority that's being asked for?
Well, the intention of the request for the new authority was to allow DOD to pay cost-related contingencies, such as we had in Pakistan, and for which there's no other mechanism which existed. By that I mean things like when we first started using Pakistan bases, they were providing assistance and fuel and other things before we had a cross-servicing agreement or an AXA agreement with them. And we didn't really have a mechanism to pay those. So the intention was very benign. I think we drafted this in a rather poor way. We at the State Department fully support the intent of that bill, but as you may have read in the newspapers, unfortunately, we had a little contretemps about whose prerogatives were being upheld and not. And our view, and the Department of Defense's view, is that we want to work with the committee and the defense committees to make sure that the prerogatives, the House and Senate committees, and the prerogatives of the Secretary of State, as the chairman mentioned, as the sort of the overseer of foreign policy and foreign aid is upheld.
Now, you just said all of what we like to have. The language in the supplemental kinds of takes the Defense Authority and leaves that not so much with the entities you just mentioned, the subcommittees or the State Department, but solely with the Secretary of Defense.
Well, and I hope you'll see from my comments that my own view is we drafted that in a rather shoddy manner. We at the Department of State support what defense wanted to do. We want to work this out in a way that protects our prerogatives, first of all, tell the truth, and the prerogatives of the Foreign Ops Committees in the House and Senate, and work with the defense committees. And so then, I can tell you that defense and we will come up and work with you to get language that is appropriate, that preserves those prerogatives.
So then from what you say, Mr. Secretary, you want us to continue to work with the language and not to have that made solely at the discretion of the Secretary of Defense, but in a coordinated effort.
With under the overall supervision of the Secretary of State, which allows the Foreign Ops Committees to.
We'd appreciate that because if the Secretary does have that sole responsibility, terrorism, human rights, non-payment of dues, those kinds of things, he can ignore those where the State Department now has to adhere to those. So that would be important to this committee, I'm sure.
Well, they're important to us, too.
Thank you. Number two, Mr. Chairman, if I might, our friendly states around the nation of Israel, and you mentioned Jordan, and many Palestinians live in Jordan. We can say Saudi Arabia, perhaps a couple others, who are now, and maybe I heard you say earlier, you may not be able to answer. Secretary Powell is just returning, and maybe the president has to be debriefed. But are we losing our support in the region because of the very serious conflict that we're now having in the Middle East? Can you speak on that as much as you can?
We are clearly, at least temporarily, losing some support. All of our embassies in the Middle East have had to be buttoned up over the past 2 weeks, and
what does that mean?
Secured.
Okay.
Against any demonstrations, et cetera. And we've had, very unfortunately, for the first time in, I believe, 20 years, student demonstrations in Alexandria, Egypt, for instance, which were directed against an American center in which a young student died. We had a young man die in Bahrain as he was actually got into our embassy. 20 or 30 people demonstrating got into the embassy and burned some cars. So temporarily, we're in a bit of a problem. And Secretary Powell's comments, if you noticed in Israel as he was departing to return to the United States, tried to address the three factors in this equation. One, our support for Israel, which is not at question. The support for Palestinian people, that they have a right to have hopes and aspirations. And our Arab friends, that we were trying to address these problems because Secretary Powell was trying to keep the streets calm. So we've got a problem.
We do have a problem, and we certainly want to work with you. You mentioned Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, some of the other countries who have been friendly, many who are Arab ethnicities. It's a balancing act. I think it's very serious, and we look forward to the debriefing that Secretary Powell will give the president, as well as what the Congress is able to receive, because I think we have to be actors and players in this whole discussion as we represent the people of America.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure I'm not going to volunteer Secretary Powell to appear. I'm sure he will be appearing on this subject. He is at 10:30 meeting with the president, and afterward the president, he will appear publicly at, I think, around noon and make some comments about this situation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Armitage.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to follow a bit, if I may, on the line that Ms. Kilpatrick was following herself. I, as you know, chair the subcommittee that deals with national security. Throughout the years I've served on this subcommittee, I've rather strongly agreed with that view that the fundamental leadership relative to FMF should be with the State Department. Clearly, if we're looking at long-range foreign policy, while military assistance does play a role in all of that, if you're going to support the long-range policy direction, one has to deal with military assistance with great care, diplomatically and otherwise. That's the long-range view. In the shorter term, there can be obvious difficulties and complications. So the law does provide that the Defense Department has responsibility in supervising, administering some of those funds in certain circumstances. I'm concerned about the short term. A lot of communication between DOD and state has taken place regarding the language that's come up in the supplemental that gives DOD authority relative to certain portions of essentially what would be described as FMS. But when we are in a place like Afghanistan, and in a very short period of time, you're interested in actively, aggressively training and retraining, giving capability to troops in the field, that requires very, very quick action. The State Department has lots of priorities around the world. None of our major agencies are noted for quick action, especially when they're competing priorities. So I'm concerned very much with that question. As we're training and retraining troops in Afghanistan, as we're looking to fighting this war across borders in the surrounding area in a relatively short time frame, it strikes me that some authority for action is needed by the Department of Defense. Now, whether it needs to really massage and change significantly existing authority, I don't know, and the broader authority of the President. But would you help me address that question? In DOD, is it going to totally violate your circumstance if we have language that extends authority relative to this kind of training and retraining?
Well, Mr. Lewis, I think the authority as drafted by us is a little broader in scope than we really intended. On the question of Afghanistan, for instance, and training the Afghan army, et cetera, notwithstanding the elephant-like movements of a bureaucracy, whether it's state or DOD for that matter, the authorities that exist in FMF, for instance, allow us to have very quick dispersing.
Allows, that's correct.
Pardon me?
Allows, that's correct.
Yeah, no, I say that I can't gainsay what you say about bureaucracy. I'm in it, and
right.
It's slow when plotting. But the contingencies that we were trying to address in this language were more like the contingencies we found in Pakistan, as I mentioned, when we first went in and had no authorities to pay for some services and fuel and things of that nature, use of APUs to start the jet engines. Those are the things we didn't know how to address them. And that's what the kind of contingency we were trying to address. I think we were a little too broad. It's why I wrote my letter to OMB to signal we need to work this thing out, and why I'm pledging to you, and I can pledge my brothers and sisters in the Defense Department to come up and work with the committee and the Senate to make sure we've got language that we think really addresses the contingency you spoke about and doesn't trample on both prerogatives of the House and the Senate, and, by the way, on the Secretary of State's overview of foreign policy.
Well, I must say that the Defense Department does have serious capability as it relates to using those monies, especially in the training arena. There's little doubt that quick action was necessary, is necessary in other circumstances in the immediate term in the region. We are considering, as you know, the language that's being submitted, and while I have reservations, I also have reservations about my closing the door to the request that's being made by the Defense Department. I presume that this request and this direction was not made without some consultation with higher levels.
No, we want the flexibility that's in this language. The Secretary of State supports giving DOD that flexibility. But what we want to make sure is that he and you all maintain your oversight roles in foreign ops and he in foreign policy. But the general flexibility that we were seeking was developed in conjunction with state and defense. So I say, I don't think we drafted this as well as we should have.
Yeah, okay.
It's too broad.
Now, you said that in your statement. I must say that my traditional support for FMF being within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee as well as the State Department is comforted by the fact that the Secretary of State himself has some considerable experience in both arenas. I mean, but nonetheless, it does bring us to the nexus of a very challenging policy consideration that I think deserves a lot of massaging over time.
You're absolutely right, and we want to massage it with you and with the Defense Department with you together.
Do you have some time, Mr. Chairman? I'd be happy to move on.
I would. Your time has expired before I call on Mr. Rothman. I'm going to exercise my prerogative, which I rarely do, to follow up, however, on this at a question, because we really need. This is a very important question, and we really need to get to the bottom of this thing. First of all, though you can't say it here, I will say it. My understanding is there really was no consultation between state and defense on this issue. That it was zero zilch consultation. It was just in there. My question to you: you talk about the flexibility. That 5-line provision, notwithstanding any other provision of the law, not to exceed $100 million from appropriations of the Department of Defense, may be used to support foreign nations, etc., in the furtherance of the global war on terrorism. Why do we need that at all?
We were trying to address the problem that I addressed earlier, Mr. Chairman, about before we had agreements with Pakistan and others, we were making use of their services. We didn't have mechanisms to pay.
Well,
we were getting bills without a mechanism to pay.
But you do have that now, don't you? That ability?
Where we have an agreement.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Where we have an agreement, we have that mechanism.
This for reimbursing them, this provision is not necessary, is it?
Not for Pakistan, no, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Rothman.
But what about Afghanistan?
Mr. Lewis, go ahead.
What about Afghanistan?
Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think we'd have any problem with any in Afghanistan, but
no, because I think the language is broad enough to do anything in Afghanistan.
A state that we don't have agreements with, which we have a more speckled relationship with. So we were trying to address the contingency that we found in Pakistan. We didn't have the agreements that exist that allowed us to pay. We do now have it with Pakistan, and we're in good shape.
Thank you. Mr. Rothman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, sir.
You are one of the few, let's put it this way, or the best in this administration to not only present an intelligent and articulate answer to our questions, but you have a wonderful, plain, clear-spoken style, and I appreciate that. And I have the sense that you have the highest degree of integrity, and we can rely on what you say.
Thank you very much. Some have questioned that from time to time, but I'm very grateful.
Something's coming here.
Yeah, I'll take it when I can get it.
So far, so good.
Yes, sir.
And I'm grateful. 2 questions, if I can get them in, one on the Middle East and one on Colombia. On the Middle East, did I hear you say that Saudi Arabia had been helpful, or I didn't actually hear that from you, did I?
No, I didn't address Saudi Arabia.
Yes, I didn't hear that myself coming from you. I note that in the frontline states request the emergency supplemental, Jordan, Bahrain, Oman, Yemen are getting specific allocations. And then there's a general category, in addition to that, of $50 million economic initiatives for the Middle East. Would you just spend just 45 seconds of my time on that? And I know, and if you can fit in within that time, describe, are there specific parties in the Middle East that you are expecting to engage in this with these economic initiatives? And have you approached them, and what kind of a response have you gotten?
Yes, this whole idea for this came out of the meeting with President Mubarak and President Bush, where Mr. Bush announced an economic initiative. We want to have a certain amount of money available to match or even exceed with philanthropic donors, and we can address areas that are not traditionally addressed by us. We want to get everything from enterprise funds in Egypt, and this is, by the way, following along the lines of a lot of the work done by Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist. Try to make better use of dead capital in Egypt, try to improve education, not just education and scholarship opportunity for the wealthy and the well-to-do, but for others who might strive.
Is this designed solely for Egypt?
No, it is not, but Egypt is our test case, and that's where we're looking at it in the first instance. We'd want to broaden it to the Middle East in general, and that's hence the name MEEI.
Okay, but you don't know...
And it has been discussed with Egypt.
Have you discussed any of these initiatives with other Middle Eastern countries yet?
I have not. We brought a young woman who just happens to have the name of Liz Cheney on board to actually shepherd these programs. And the reason we brought her, she worked for me 10 years ago, And she's an expert in the international financial institutions. That's what she's been doing for the last 10 years. So we're trying to marry up a certain amount of money from you all, if you're so willing, the international financial institutions and philanthropic donors. She's talked to the Gateses and Steve Case and others.
I think it's a wonderful idea, and I wish you well on that. On the Colombian emergency supplemental, it's $6 million related to protecting the Caño Limón pipeline. In addition, your 2003 request, as I understand it, is an additional $98 million, a total of $104 million to Colombia for the protection of a 400-mile-long pipeline. I further understand that the guerrillas are attacking the first 75 miles of the 400-mile pipeline. Is it conceivable that if we're going to spend $104 million now, when they're working on the first the guerrillas are attacking the first 75 of the 400-mile long pipeline, that we're going to be asked to fund this more money for the rest of it? And let me give you some sub-questions. And is America the sole recipient of the oil that comes out of that pipeline? And if not, I imagine it is not. Are the other nations of the world who get oil out of that pipeline, are they going to contribute to protecting that pipeline as well?
I don't think any of them are, but I may be misinformed on that. Protection of the pipeline. I think that others do benefit from the oil, and as a fungible commodity, I guess, oil is oil, and whether we get it or someone else get it, it all raises the general oil market level. It is conceivable. Yes. Is it on the drawing board in the administration? Not to my knowledge, sir.
I'm just curious, is this $104 million to protect the pipeline, is it really just extra, another way to provide military assistance to Colombia to defend themselves against these terrorists, which I would not necessarily oppose, or is it specifically to protect this particular pipeline, which, again, I'd be interested to know how much oil Americans, the United States of America, gets out of that pipeline. And if it's not significant, and this is really just about the pipeline and not general military assistance to Colombia, then I darn well would like to see the other nations who are getting oil benefits out of that pipeline contribute. If our share is minuscule, what we get out of that, I would be reluctant to support it.
Well, I think I understand. I'll have to take the second part of the question. I don't know how much we get, and I'll provide it. On the first part, I think we have to be absolutely fair. The pipeline is vital to Colombia. In the first instance, it is a lifeline of sorts for them. They're in a real tussle. In my view, a tussle for survival. I'm actually surprised more people aren't upset about it. I think the fact that it's been going on for over 20 years has let people get used to it. And we want to train, as my colleague Mark Grossman was up here last week, I think, or the week before, testifying, we want to train battalions, another battalion, to be able to affect that pipeline security. Could those forces be used in counterinsurgency? Absolutely. Could they also be used to protect the pipeline from insurgents and terrorist attacks? Absolutely. But I don't think there's an ability to draw a fine line between simply soldiers almost walking the pipeline and those that might be used for a more offensive prosecution of guerrillas.
When Secretary Grossman was here, we had a discussion about the level of financial commitment from the Colombians themselves vis-a-vis their gross national product. Do you have any follow-up on that, sir?
Yeah, we heard very clearly from several members of the committee. I think Mr. Callahan was particularly vocal on this subject, as were others. And Mark took it back to us, and we discussed it. President Pastrana is with our president, or was earlier this morning. And the message that we got from that hearing was very clear. Colombia has to do more. And they've got to do more, not just in the human rights and the areas that we have as a subject of our law, but they have to do more in their own interest and for their own interest. And that's the message I think President Pastrana will be getting in order to continue support from the U.S.
And he'll be getting the message from the president?
Well, he's going to get it from us, and it was suggested to the president. I can't say that he's going to do it. I expect he will. But
thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Nolenberg is next.
Chairman, thank you very much, and welcome this morning, Mr. Armitage.
Thank you, sir.
Nice to see you. I was not here a few moments ago when questions arose about the supplemental funding potential for Israel, but
Yes, sir.
and I understand the sequence of those questions. I've been briefed on that and the answers you provided. Let me ask one more,
Yes, sir.
which I don't believe was asked, and that is simply this, that within the administration there was apparently blockage because the State Department did recommend $200 million. Is that true?
Yes, unfortunately, I have to admit to you it's true.
Would you, let me ask you this question, would you oppose an effort in Congress, by Congress, to provide supplemental funding for Israel?
No, of course we won't oppose supplemental funding for Israel. I'll make the point, however, I make sure that additive funding is great. I couldn't afford in this what I think is a relatively lean request to take it out of Hyde.
I understand that, and I do appreciate that, but you would not oppose an effort by we here in Congress to add that supplemental money in.
I've got a good sense of my own self-interest.
Thank you. Let me go to another question, and that has to do with Cato. I've been on this subcommittee ever since we started funding Cato and the agreed framework, and we've had conversations about this, as you well know.
Yes,
and you know my view. I've been saying for years that we shouldn't be doing this, and frankly, because of the fact that North Korea doesn't live up to its end of the bargain. It's very clear in our Foreign Operations Bill that these funds will not be available unless the administration certifies that North Korea is complying with all provisions of the agreed framework. And earlier this year, and you well know this, the President did determine not to certify that North Korea is complying with all of its provisions. And in essence, that they weren't meeting the requirements, but in fact, we find ourselves still funding that effort to the extent of, and I think in this bill, it is for 03, it's $75 million. Now, I recognize that the
95 next year, right?
yes,
Right.
yes, that's right. But the certification has to do with the 02 bill. But here we are proposing the 03 bill, and the President says you're not meeting the requirements, and yet we continue to fund this thing. Here's a country, I don't have to tell you, I know you respect and understand this, that is part of that so-called axis of evil. And I frankly considered them a part of that before the President said they were. I think many on this committee thought so too. So my question, I guess, is isn't there something wrong with this picture? The President doesn't provide certification, and here we are upping the ante. We're even going beyond what we have been doing. Why should we send this money on behalf of North Korea under these circumstances?
Sure, I think the only difficult conversation you and I have ever had was about this issue. I'll note that the President did not certify, but the language that we used was pretty careful. We said we lacked the information to be able to certify that North Korea was living up to all of their requirements. There are 3 certifications required, one on North-South nuclear cooperation, which we could not certify, another on non-proliferation, which we could not certify, and the third was that they were keeping their part of the agreed framework. And we lack insight and knowledge, and we didn't feel comfortable saying to you that they're making the grade when we couldn't grade them. So we gave them no grade, and that's important. In a way, we went somewhat towards where you've been. And I think over time we'll know if we're right or wrong, because the North Koreans, in a recent, with a recent visitor from South Korea, Ambassador Lim Dong-won, indicated they wanted to restart discussions with the United States about this matter. I think the understanding in North Korea has finally hit them that there's a new team in town, and that you don't automatically pick up where your predecessor left off. A little uncomfortable for them, perhaps, but I think the message has gotten through. So I think we'll see as we move forward whether it worked or not. All I can tell you is they've now indicated they want to see Ambassador Pritchard on this matter. So I think we went somewhat to your direction, but we can't say they're not living up.
Yeah. Well, I do appreciate the steps that have been taken. I appreciate the President not providing that certification. And I guess what we have to do is look again at this, continue to look at it with very, very strong scrutiny in mind to make sure that we are seeing some improvement over there, because there doesn't appear to be what we'd like to have. There isn't what we'd like to have for sure. So,
Chairman used the term about skepticism, and I understand that, and it's well warranted in this case.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I would buy that word. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Armitage.
We'll have time for one more set of questions. We have 2 votes, so we'll go over and vote, get the second vote, come right back, so we won't have much of an interruption. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to start by welcoming Deputy Secretary Armitage here today, and I also want to thank you, sir, for your testimony. Sir, I have 4 questions. Does the name Sareda Sala mean anything to you?
Asala?
Sareda Sala. Sareda Sala is a 21-year-old American woman born in Washington, D.C., who was killed in the first days of the offensive in Ramallah. I'm wondering what is being done by your office and by American officials to find out information about how and why she was killed.
I'll find out.
Many of my colleagues have many priorities for what you and your officers should be doing, but I think one thing we can probably all agree on is that one of your primary responsibilities is the protection of Americans abroad, and certainly Americans who are living in the West Bank, in Israel. And I'm equally as concerned about what your office is doing to find out the number of Americans who live in the West Bank, what instructions your office has given them with respect to their security, those Americans also living in Israel. And I specifically would like information other than travel at your own risk and get out. I'd like to know what your office is doing with respect to that. My understanding...
Can I make a comment on that, Mr.
You certainly
Jackson,
can,
now,
sir.
please?
You certainly can.
I obviously will have to provide you the numbers, both of Americans who live in Israel, Americans who live in the territories of Palestinian origin, and I'll do that. Generally, as a general matter, whether it's in Israel or anywhere else, or whether our consulate in Jerusalem, we have a no double standard policy. That is that anything that's told to my folks in the embassies has to be made public as well. And that's quite different from what you correctly point out as the travel warnings, which say you shouldn't travel here or travel at your own risk or don't go there. But I'll get the specific answer to your question.
I'm very concerned about the interests of these Americans who were born in the United States, who are living in this very difficult geography and situation, and what your office is doing to instruct them about and provide them with the kind of security that they need. We've also seen, Mr. Secretary, pictures and reports of incredible destruction and devastation to the civilian infrastructure in the West Bank. All of us have seen the water systems destroyed, pipes broken, records and computers in places like the Ministry of Education. As a matter of fact, it was on Nightline just a few days ago. Ministry of Housing, also computers destroyed. For a number of years, this committee has supported U.S. assistance to help develop exactly this kind of infrastructure in order to improve the lives of Palestinians, to help reduce the threats of terrorism to Israelis. Given all of the recent damage and destruction, I'm wondering, does the State Department or USAID plan to carry out any kind of assessment of the cost of the current IDF offensive to U.S.-funded projects?
I know that we've discussed an assessment of the damage more broadly, both in human terms as well as infrastructure. And by the way, it's both Israel and Palestine, though obviously the Palestinian areas, the damage has been quite extensive. We have not moved beyond that to specific what was U.S. funded and what was European Union funded, et cetera.
Well, has the idea of explaining to Mr. Sharon and also to Mr. Arafat by Secretary Powell of U.S. funded projects that it is essentially a waste of money appropriated by this committee if, in fact, those projects are not defended and not part of any offensive in the region?
Well, is that a question, sir?
I guess it is, sir. Somewhat rhetorical.
No, I want to try to address your question. There's plenty of discussion between Secretary Powell and Minister Sharon and Chairman Arafat about what's going on both sides of the line. Suicide bombings on the one hand, which rip away lives and aspirations of young people who are in church or in prayer or at Seder. In the same token, there are Palestinians who are not fighters who are killed as well. And that's why Powell spent his efforts at trying to stop it, bring it down. The question of infrastructure, it's a horrible fallout of this tragedy. And if we move forward, we're going to have to, and the international community is going to have to move forward and address this. But you can't move forward and address the humanitarian challenge and the infrastructure challenge until we have some sort of political process that allows some hope that we won't repeat this terrible tragedy.
Well, I accept that, and I recognize as well that these events are tragic, and they are obviously tragic on both sides. Everyone on the committee is fully appreciative of that, but it doesn't appear to me that this committee should be appropriating any more money for vital infrastructure unless we're willing to come up with a plan for protecting the vital infrastructure that we're supporting. So does the State Department have a plan for protecting this committee's resources in that area, which we have designed and specifically are spending to help reduce tensions in the region?
Look, sir, the State Department is not going to protect infrastructure in any country. That's the nature of that's the business of the host country and their authorities and their police forces or their military if it comes to that. So the answer, I guess, would be no, we don't, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The subcommittee will stand temporarily in recess. We'll resume just as soon as we get back from this vote.
Remember, you left it.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, how are you? We have a plan. Actually, we've begun a survey. There is no damage. How you doing? Good to see you.
The subcommittee will resume, and since I'm the only member here, I get to start asking some more of my questions. We'll go back to the regular order. We still have Mr. Kingston and Ms. Pelosi, if they return, to go back before we start a second round of questions. I want to ask a question, Mr. Secretary, about Pakistan, which we've had some discussion about here today. We obviously have been very successful in getting a very high degree of cooperation with Pakistan in this war against terrorism, and I think we're all very appreciative of the support that President Musharraf and the Pakistani government has given to us in this. They're very much on the front door of this war, and but of course we also know that they bear a major responsibility for the initial success of the Taliban regime of coming to power anyhow in Afghanistan. Now, however, we're hearing some rather disturbing reports that the government of Pakistan is not cooperating as closely with the United States as it was immediately upon the events of September 11th. As an example, Pakistan has balked at our proposals to go into the area bordering Afghanistan to hunt down al-Qaeda terrorists. In addition, 800 of the 2,000 Islamic extremists who were originally imprisoned in January have reportedly been released from jail. And finally, there are questions as to the degree of cooperation which the Pakistani authorities provided in the U.S. in investigating the murder of the reporter from the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Pearl. In a newspaper column of a couple of weeks ago, Jim Hoagland wrote, quote, "The clear instructions that Deputy Secretary of State Armitage gave to a Pakistani intelligence commander soon after September 11th, halt all support for terrorism or else, have with time faded and seemingly lost their impact. Washington is now negotiating with Musharraf, not forcing him to act," unquote. The supplemental request has another $145 million for Pakistan, and the 2003 budget includes another $250 million beyond that. Before Congress acts on these proposals, I think we want to have an assurance from you and others in the administration that Pakistan continues to be a full and active partner in the war on terrorism. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I'm not no one's in a position to give you a full assurance. I think I can state the facts as I know them, Mr. Chairman. First of all, about 2 weeks ago, Pakistanis involved with U.S. law enforcement and intelligence operatives took down 3 safe houses, had a couple of gun battles, and captured one of the leading al-Qaeda figures who's now being debriefed, Mr. Zubaydah, which is not a bad sign of cooperation. I think to the extent there's been an interruption, particularly on the western border of Pakistan, it was more involved in the fact that Pakistan and India were glaring at each other over Kashmir. And as you well know, sir, many forces were moved from west to east on Pakistan. That trend is reversing to some extent. Some of the Pakistani forces are going back home. The question of the assistance in the Pearl murder investigation, I think it was unfortunate that that the Pakistanis apparently had Saeed for several days before they informed the United States. But in terms of following up and helping Mrs. Pearl and things of that nature, I should let her speak for herself, but I talked to her during that time, and she seemed to me to be quite satisfied with their assistance. I've got a fair degree of confidence that we're going to continue to get assistance from Pakistan. I think they've thrown their lot in. I don't think they have a choice. I can't gainsay what you said about their responsibilities for the Taliban and their support for the Pashtuns in large measure for 10 years. But I can say that I've got a fair degree of confidence that they have made a decision, and they have very little choice but to follow through with it.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I certainly hope you're right. Certainly in my, you just have the impression that maybe it's because of the vote that is coming up, and President Musharraf is finding himself engaged in a political campaign, although he's got no opposition in this campaign, that he wants a very sizable vote. But there just seems to be a noticeable coolness on the part of the Pakistanis towards the United States at this point.
Well, I haven't personally noticed it. We have pretty good conversations with them back and forth since the terrible grenading in the church in Islamabad. I think it was such a shocking thing that perhaps we have, at least in Islamabad, gone to ground a bit. We're not as totally active. That was a very shocking, terrible moment for the embassy. But I noticed that from the Secretary's point of view, he has fairly frequent discussions with President Musharraf, and fairly congenial ones, and I've not noticed the cooling, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have members back who have not had a chance to ask their questions, so we'll resume the regular questioning with Mr. Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, it's great to have you back before this committee, and we certainly commend everything that you and the State Department and this administration is doing to make the world a safer place. One of the things that we politicians will be doing a lot of this summer and this fall is taking polls to find out what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right, and what public perceptions are out there about us that we need to correct between now and November. And so we'll be doing that. And the thought occurs to me, while we seem to have a lot of friends in this world, we still seem to have a lot of enemies, and a lot of those enemies are ones that do get foreign aid from us. And I'm wondering if there isn't some kind of a mechanism that we could use, surveying, polling, or whatever, to find out amongst countries where we're doing things for them that we're not getting a little more credit. Case in point, of course, Afghanistan. I know it's difficult to get the word out to the people, but as I understand, we were given $173 million in aid directly and indirectly prior to 9/11, and you know, if they're oppressed by Taliban government and we're still helping them, can we get that word out to the population that the American people, regardless of what these thugs are saying about them, they're the ones who are responsible for the grain that you're eating or enjoying or something like that? And it just appears to me something beyond putting our label "Made in USA" on the packages. There should be something that we can do to persuade the people of, you know, not just to get credit, but it's a national security issue. We want to make sure that our friends are our friends.
Mr. Kingston, you point to a dilemma. There's 174 million, I think, before the Taliban, during the Taliban regime, in humanitarian assistance, and I think we get wrapped around our very, I think, formidable and proper humanitarian impulse to feed people who are starving and put behind the politics. And I don't know how you modulate that, because the humanitarian impulse of the United States and Americans as citizens of the world is pretty great, and thank God it is so. More broadly, on finding out what works and what doesn't in terms of foreign aid, I think that's what we're getting at. I can only say that we've recognized this in the department as a problem. Assistant Secretary Burnham, our chief financial officer here, has redone what we call an MPP, a mission planning, it was a profile, performance plan, and we get the missions to tell us what they spend their time on, where our assistance goes, what we're seeing for it. So over time, we'll be able to judge if we're putting money down the proverbial rat hole, or else there's some recognizable benefit beyond the humanitarian impulse that I think we all feel. This has been changed this year because we want to be able to grade ourselves a little better, and at least be able to, and I think it helps us in our presentations to you. So I'm aware of the problem, and I think we've started in a minor way on the answer, but we've got a lot to do.
I think there just should be some way we can measure what is our 5-year return on investment. If the country's moving towards democracy or moving towards pro-West, or there's trade benefits or something, that we can have some idea. And I certainly would never suggest that in a disaster situation like Rwanda, when we're rushing in there and people are dying and dead, that we go out and give our business cards. We don't want to be in a situation like that. But I think in terms of a steady, long-term partnership with the country, it should be understanding that you are getting assistance, and it is American assistance, and make no mistake. In terms of Palestinian PLO, what kind of aid do they get from us? Because I hear all kinds of different stories about them getting some indirect support for this and that. And
no, we're not, the PLO, no. The Palestinian Authority, we had stopped the aid to the Palestinian Authority directly, and providing it through NGOs and other things that directly affect the Palestinian people. And the president, a couple of days ago, signed a new $20 million, I think, release for UNWRA activities. But I don't think we give anything nothing to PLO for sure. Okay. I think we've stopped
for
with
the
PLA.
PLA, there is some, but it goes through NGOs?
It goes for the people. We wanted to get out to the people and not to go through. The Palestinian Authority was, I think, widely seen to the authority itself as corrupt.
Palestinian Authority. PA,
Just to clarify that, it goes to the West Bank, but none of it goes to the authority.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, yes. Right.
Well, we have a new member that's joined us here who has not had a first round of questioning, so we'll go to Mr. Bonilla, and then we'll start our second round.
Morning, Secretary.
Morning, sir.
Want to start out by asking about setting up the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement project, and in conjunction with Mexico. And I just want to make sure that as we do this, that we are, I know we're looking at this as a national project, but we want to make sure that some of the folks that are actually on the front line along the border are consulted, because they're the ones that have been dealing with a lot of this for many, many years. So is that happening, and if not, why? And if not, when will that happen? When we'll start including the locals in this project?
Yeah, I'm under the strong impression, I'm a little hesitant to give you a really robust answer because I'm not sure I'm right, that we are doing that. And Rand Beers, our Assistant Secretary, is very much, your point is to recruit locals who really know what's going on, vet them, obviously, and then put them into the game. And my understanding is that's very much part of his project. And we have a different ongoing and complementary project that we're suggesting in our emergency supplemental request for $25 million for border security, and it's coordinated Frank Taylor, anti-terrorism, and Governor Ridge's Homeland Security, and it goes to such things as information sharing and systems and passengers and goods that cross our borders, increased inspection capability, including mobile X-ray machines and things of that nature, train and equip Mexican law enforcement agencies to prevent migrants from entering the United States, and creating additional entrance, sort of high-volume lanes at ports of entry, those kind of things, and that's all covered in our supplementary.
The reason I ask is because in the area that I have down along the southwest border, I have almost 800 miles of that Texas-Mexico border that includes that huge land port at Laredo. and they moved a monumental amount of traffic across there every day. Not only that, I have that area which is similar to much of the terrain that goes west of Texas as well, where you have they're very isolated, desolate. In some cases, over the years, there might be 1 or 2 federal law enforcement agents, more than likely Border Patrol, that are patrolling hundreds of square miles of territory. So the possibility of not just narcotics moving from some of the areas that where manpower has been beefed up to these more desolate areas has increased. And in some cases, we're asking park rangers to carry some of the load, and especially in Big Bend National Park. That's a huge part of that left hanging part of the state as you're looking at the Texas map. So to our knowledge, none of our folks down there have been part of this process. And again, with an 800-mile span of border, I think that's significant.
Bonilla, if you'll entertain a call from Rand Beers, our Assistant Secretary, I'll let the expert give you an expert answer.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate that. I only have another question related to Afghanistan, which I know has been discussed in great detail here today. But we heard some time ago from our Director of USAID that because of the extreme volatile and outright dangerous conditions that our rebuilding personnel are operating under, that was a very, very serious concern when he appeared here before us a few weeks ago. And I don't believe in that period of time much has changed, but if it has, please let us know. And if it hasn't, I guess it's something that this subcommittee needs to continue addressing, because we don't want our folks operating in that kind of environment if we can help it.
It was certainly an inhibiting factor when we put together our request. We were reluctant to look for more reconstruction aid if we weren't sure we'd be able to be safe and have a presence. So some things have changed. For instance, in Herat, which is in the far west of Afghanistan, our ambassador recently visited and found the city under complete and total control. It seems to me that this is an area that we could start moving out in developmental assistance. So I think what Director Natsios explained to you, sir, is very much a work in progress, and I think we'll have a couple steps forward and an occasional step back. President Bush reminded us in a meeting I attended the other day that if you look at the history of Afghanistan, whether it was the British experience or the Soviet experience, they did pretty well in their first year, and when they took their eye off the ball, the second year and the third year started to go the wrong way, and we've got to make sure we don't take our eye off the ball, Mr. Bonilla.
Now, the last thing I want to touch on, if I could, is this question that I asked the Secretary last year, and I asked it again this year in an earlier hearing, and I asked it during the hearing on Colombian assistance, on the State Department's progress on drug certification. As you know, I and many of my colleagues believe this entire process is flawed and needs reform. And Secretary Powell a year ago said that he understood where I was coming from and perhaps agreed that the system needed to be reformed, and we need to have a system of accountability that truly deters drug trafficking. And sometimes over the years we get in political hot water because of this system that's in place now. That's all we have. But so my question is there any progress being made at the State Department in changing this process so it can be actually address more the legitimate reforms that are taking place in countries?
You know, if there is, it's not visible to me. And so I apologize for that. I'm just going to have to get into it. But it hasn't come to me, so I suspect not much is going on. I suspect this is a case of taking our eye off the ball because of the war on terrorism, et cetera.
Right.
But I owe you an answer, and I'll give it to you.
And I certainly understand that, and because I know the priorities have shifted, but that's something I'm going to keep asking about.
No, I've got the message, sir.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mooney. Ms. Pelosi is back, so we will get her questions, and then we will begin our second round of questioning with Ms. Kilpatrick. Ms. Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your good work on behalf of our country. As in this capacity and as ranking on intelligence, we're all very, very proud to work closely with the administration in the war against terrorism. This supplemental is a very important one. I want to associate myself with the concerns raised by our ranking member, Congresswoman Lowy, about the fact that the funding that the President had suggested, which will help us alleviate poverty, alleviate the fury of despair and among peoples of the world, that is so important in our fight against terrorism, would not begin until FY 2004. Ms. Lowy made that point. I want to reinforce it with you. I have very serious concerns that there is no funding for HIV/AIDS in this supplemental, which is indeed an emergency and has a very responsible place in an emergency supplemental, and I think that point has been made by others as well. I want to take this occasion and use my time, though, Mr. Secretary, to ask you a question that is very bothersome to me. As I say, we all stand shoulder to shoulder with President Bush in war on terrorism, and as you know, I have worked closely with the administration in that regard. That was why I was so disappointed last week when the administration was ambivalent or even cavalier in response to the coup in Venezuela. Promoting democracy in the world is an important pillar of our foreign policy. Certainly, it's a value in our hemisphere. And I talked with my colleague, Congressman Callahan, when he was chairman, I was ranking. We visited President Chavez in Venezuela, and we know full well, speaking only for myself, the challenge that he presents to U.S. interest. This is no defense of President Chavez, but it is a defense of democratically elected governments. And I'd like to ask you a couple questions. One is, did we have any participation in the coup d'etat? And secondly, why was not the administration's response to a coup in our hemisphere more forceful and supported to a constitutional process? The leader of the coup, upon assuming power, dissolved the legislature, dissolved the Supreme Court, abolished the Constitution, and said there would be no elections for a year. I know our policies are always rooted in constitutional reform and respecting democratic processes. So this coup did not represent that either, and yet the administration, as I say, was at best cavalier and at worst, I think, dangerous to our interest in the nature of the response, a reaction that was not shared by any other country in the hemisphere. Could you comment on this? Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. I was taught, and I believe this administration embraces the feeling that where principle is involved, we should be deaf to expediency. And I think that the formulation of our statements surrounding this event in Venezuela were not what they should have been. They certainly don't appear to be in hindsight. But like the music of Wagner was once described as being better than it sounded, I think our story in this is a little better than it's been reported. And to direct answer your question, I have no knowledge, and I have asked about any participation, giving enthusiasm to this event before it happened. I've gotten negative answers across the board, Mrs. Pelosi. Second, the communications that our records show in the department for months with the Venezuelans, whether opposition or government, was consistent on the need to follow the Constitution and constitutional processes. And the big irony for me, besides my friend Chris Dodd saying there was no adult supervision at the State Department, kind of hurt my feelings because I was there, Secretary was gone, is that we signed in Peru on September 11th the Charter of Democracies for the Hemisphere.
I understand that.
Which directly makes the point you're making. So I said that's the irony here. I think our public statements weren't sufficient. We're trying to do a little better. We've worked with the OAS. Probably Secretary Powell will attend the OAS meeting this afternoon to make the points that I think that you'd be proud to have the government make, your government. But as I say, that it wasn't quite as bad as it was reported, but it was not good enough for a principled nation.
It didn't live up to the standards that you have set.
I agree.
And also, I'm very concerned about the participation of Assistant Secretary Reich in all of this, and will be. Do you have any knowledge of his participation in any of these conversations?
I have knowledge that it was misreported in the New York Times that he had called to the leader of the then opposition, the interim president. That was untrue. and I think that's been corrected today in subsequent publications. He, along with most members, certainly in the WHA Bureau, have met as a matter of course with both opposition and government figures. I myself have in the normal course of my business. As I say, I have no knowledge other than the strict adherence to the Constitution as the message from the United States. Now, during that whole time, from Friday afternoon on, I probably talked to Ambassador Shapiro 5 or 6 times, primarily, and in fact exclusively, about what's going on. Are our people safe? Are the roads to the airport open in case we have to get them out? It was kind of a confused time.
Well, Secretary Reich's reputation has preceded him, unfortunately, and we had hoped that there would be a change under this administration. So I appreciate what you have said here today. I know this conversation will continue, but thank you very much for answering my question so directly, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.
While others were dallying getting back from the floor, I had a chance to ask a question, so we'll go to Ms. Lowy for the second round of questions. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you. Thank you for your integrity in the honor system. I appreciate that.
Where principle is involved, be deaf to expediency.
Always can count on my chair for principle. Thank you. We've discussed this issue before, but I did want to bring it up again. As you well know, when Secretary of State Powell appeared before this committee in February, he indicated that the administration was preparing to send a team to China to evaluate the as-yet unfounded charges that the UNFPA supports coercive practices in that country. More than 3 months have passed since the President signed the FY 2002 Foreign Operations Bill, and more than 2 months have passed since Secretary Powell informed us of the formation of this team. Yet there's been no progress on any front in ensuring UNFPA receives the funding Congress intended for it. In my mind, this situation truly is an unacceptable breach of the faith in which Congress negotiated the 2002 bill with the administration. A few questions, Mr. Secretary. First, can you tell us who the administration has appointed to the fact-finding mission? When are they scheduled to depart? Well, rather than give you 4 at once, go right ahead.
And I also heard you, Mrs. Lowy, be very clear that patience has run out, and
You have a good
the Congress may be taking this matter in their own hands, a conversation which you and I had a couple of months ago. My present understanding today of this situation is that former Ambassador Bill Brown, who was ambassador in Israel and ambassador in Thailand, as well as a State Department official for years, has been selected. There is a woman, I just can't remember her name, and they're vetting 2 doctors. They want to find one of 2 doctors to go. And my understanding is they'll be embarking early May for a 2-week trip, after which the report should be issued. Interesting to you, to me, to others would be that a British similar delegation from organizations who are very skeptical about policies of the government of China went recently on a similar type mission and came back with actually very positive things to say, and it was reported in our diplomatic traffic about the UNFPA activities in China. Just for the record.
I appreciate that, and because it's moving quickly, let me just for the is it gone?
No, I forgot to even prove it on.
Oh, good, good.
No. It doesn't mean
I won't take advantage of
5 more minutes.
Okay, I won't take advantage of you. But let me ask the rest of the questions regarding that issue. And I appreciate your response to the first question. I shouldn't have reminded you, right? If you can tell us what will be the scope of the Commission's investigation, where will they visit, what will they be tasked specifically with finding out, when do you anticipate being able to make a determination about whether to release the FY 2002 funds, do you anticipate this happening before the end of the fiscal year? Once again, let me just say, many of my colleagues and I have made absolutely clear, and I know that you understand that this is a priority item for us. Nonetheless, it's clear also that the administration has stalled on acting on specific requests to release these funds. I hope you're not trying to run the clock out or until the next fiscal year.
Well, if we try to run the clock out, we'll find, as a matter of legislation, directive language, and I think that's very well understood. So I don't believe that's what's going on. And in preparation for this hearing, I asked a few questions, as you'd imagine, because I knew you were going to be there, and I know, because of your many phone calls with me, that what's on your mind. I haven't seen the scope of their investigations. A 2-week investigation, I think, will allow them to make sort of visits where UNFPA is very active and just check for themselves, of course, if abortions are in any way involved with UNFPA activities. And I'm very hopeful that they'll come back very rapidly and allow us to spend, I think the language was not to exceed $34 million for UNFPA activities. Beyond that, I'll take the question for the record and as expeditiously as possible provide you a full answer. But we're not going to, the whole administration, is not trying to run out the clock.
Well, I know that you have certainly
It's not in our self-interest because, as we've discussed.
Well, I just want to conclude that conversation because you and I think, understand each other, and we've had several conversations on this issue. But given that this was a bipartisan negotiation, given that there was an agreement, given that there was an overwhelming vote in the House on this issue, it really raises unnecessary question of the government's good faith in negotiating other issues, because to take 2 months to appoint someone to go, and now you say, and I appreciate that, it's scheduled to leave in May, I would hope that shortly, almost immediately after its return, the information would be absorbed and we can move ahead on what I feel is a very critical program. And in fact, one of the first appropriations that was made to Afghanistan was $600,000 for family planning. And most of us understand how very important this is for poor women around the world. So I would hope that you would accept these questions and these comments the way they are meant, and that we can move forward on this issue as soon as possible.
If the gentleman would yield, I'd just point out to the Secretary that this is one-year money, as the gentlelady suggested about running out the clock, and that at some point you will run afoul of the Budget Impoundment Act, because it is against the law to not spend money for policy reasons. So you will be up against that at some point very quickly.
No, I appreciate that, sir. And I know very well the arduous negotiations and the Mexico City language and all this that went into this terrific compromise.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Armitage, your 03 request involves a total of just over $16 billion. And within that package, to Israel, there's $2.7 billion proposed, and Egypt, $1.916 billion. My question relates to the whole time that we've been involved in the peace process, roughly 79 to today. My figures indicate that to Egypt has gone some $51.65 billion, to Israel some $74.35 billion, a total of over $125 billion. Two pieces of question. First, I can't see any significant evidence of improvement of the economic circumstances of average people, especially poor people in Egypt during all that time. I'm worried about stability there. Clearly, economic opportunity, et cetera, ought to be a part of these kinds of economic flows, and I don't see much evidence of that at all. So if you'd address that question. The second piece goes to Israel, where we're hoping these monies lead to stability. And yet one of the major problems in our difficulty there right now is the horrid circumstances of the people who are on the West Bank largely, but who operate within Israel as well. The Palestinians have horrible conditions. They've been the core of this confrontation. We ought to be criticizing those pools of oil money for their lack of support, but what have we done, or what have our dollars done to help overcome that circumstance?
Well, I think it's a two-part question, and it's kind of a many-part answer. In the first, and I don't mean to be trite, the fact that we haven't had conflict between Egypt and Israel is a noteworthy event.
Of course.
But there's more to it. We've successfully, in the military side, weaned the then Egyptian armed forces completely off, as far as I know, almost completely off the former Soviet systems, and they're all compatible with our systems, which both helps us, as it did in the Gulf War, and compatible warfare. But it also, I think, is a guarantee that Egypt wouldn't be starting war because of the supply chain. I am as despondent as you about the lot of the Egyptian people. There are a lot of them.
Yep.
There are a lot of them. And the bureaucracy in Egypt, we were joking about our own. It makes ours look like greased lightning. And that adds to the, I think, the malaise and the difficulty for ordinary Egyptians. I can't speak what an Egyptian would say who's gone to school here or who has benefited from some of the programs that AID has put into effect, some of the water purification, how many Egyptians live because of some of those things that wouldn't have otherwise. I just don't have the figures, but I suspect it's significant and yet somewhat invisible in terms of something that you can see that betters the lot of the people in Israel. The fact on the military side that we've been able to maintain the Israeli military edge, technological edge, is damned important, I think, and it has, I think, kept a peace in the region for years. And second, on the economic support fund side, I think Israel is taking another 50,000 Soviet Jews, for instance, this year. And look at the immigration to Israel. And it's very much, since money is fungible, our funds and support for Israel allows the country to grow and have a future. The money for the West Bank, as the chairman correctly points out, does not go to the Palestinian Authority. It goes to the people of Palestine. And they're in difficult circumstances, and now in many areas they're in worse circumstances than before. And if we get a political process going, certainly we'll be coming back to you, sir, looking for money for Palestinian, not for the PA.
Well, Mr. Secretary, when I was a newcomer here, 1979, I had just recently spent a good deal of time in Israel, and there, in that horrendous maze of their politics, a lot of the debate then was saying, what do we do about stopping the desire to extend into the West Bank, the development of communities, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that was really one of the thrusts of the majority-minority debate, and there was support on both sides to not do very much. Clearly, that debate went nowhere because there's been nothing but expansion. What has this money done to impact that sort of policy that literally has been a major source of unrest, the expansion in the West Bank?
Well, the settlements particularly are a major source of unrest. And I don't think there's a truthful answer to you other than I think that for a lot of reasons, complicated reasons, some historical, some political, there's been a reluctance to be very heavy-handed with Israel because we have no better ally and friend in the region. I mean, I don't know what to say, and I don't think that heavy-handedness works, actually. I think we have to be able to develop the proper amount of confidence in the Israelis that we're not going to leave them in the lurch, and try to work with them, as Secretary Powell was trying to do this week, to come to a better way of living, and that to realize the vision that the Secretary, but more importantly, the President laid out at the United Nations of two states, Palestine and Israel, side by side, living in peace and secure borders.
Well, let me just submit that the oil centers of control have conveniently used the Palestinians as their foil. It might be that our tendency to be more than gentle relative to Israel itself perhaps has made that foil much more effective as well as convenient.
Well, we've certainly been a lot more, the United States government, Congress, the people, have been a lot more supportive of the Palestinian people than many of their so-called supporters in the Arab world in terms of money provided, and I think in terms of actual caring about the welfare and the aspirations of the people.
Thank you. Ms. Kilpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to go to Columbia, but I've got to stay on Chairman Lewis's just a moment. 79 was 25 years ago when I was entering the Michigan State Legislature, where I served for 18 years. And the expansion of the land and the encroachment of what the Palestinians believe is their territory is one of the reasons why we're in the predicament that we're in. No easy answers to that. But we must acknowledge that that is really part of the problem. And until we deal with that, and of course Israel is our ally, and I'm not trying to take sides. I think America ought to be a negotiator, a broker. I don't think we should take sides at all. That's another problem. Having said that, that was my editorial comment.
Yes, ma'am.
Plan Colombia. 2000, since 2000, when money has actually been spent, $2.5 billion have been spent. Defense really administers 80% of it. State Department gets 20% for humanitarian needs. Relocation is what I want to get to. Is there something, or is there a document within the State Department, and someone did come over and brief me verbally, I still haven't received anything in writing, that says how and where your 20% of that humanitarian assistance has been spent in terms of putting people back into their land? They've been dislocated because we've moved their crops, bought their... Can you give me a little update on that?
Yes, there is a document, and there are probably lots of documents that we'd be glad to provide to you. And I think that most of us in the department have come to the conclusion that the alternative development, which I think you're speaking to, has not been as successful in Colombia as we'd hoped. Perhaps we didn't have the right partners, perhaps we didn't understand the problem significantly enough, and we're trying to work through that. But I don't have, unless one of my colleagues has the figures with me right here.
Oh, if you could get back to me, Mr.
I'd be
Secretary,
more than happy to, ma'am.
You know, the problem I have as a congressperson, and I support whatever we can do to eradicate drugs in America. I've said it before in my soapbox, it's the cancer of America. We know that 70% of cocaine comes from Colombia. We must do something about the interdiction. But we also have to do something about treatment on demand in America, which is getting further and further away from the people who need it. So as an appropriator and a person who represents the city of Detroit and surrounding areas, when I see people who are addicted for whatever reasons and cannot get the drugs, and the drugs continue to flow, and families are devastated, children don't have a ripple effect, it's hard for me to continue to support, on the one hand, the money that's going to Colombia and the Andean region particularly, and on the other hand, we don't have the money in our budgets here to fund treatment on demand. So the spigot continues to flow, but the treatment for those who they've now strung out in America and around the world does not get the attention that it needs. Your State Department, I know we give you what you need, and you're supposed to do what you do, and I'm sure you do that. As a congressperson, in many of our own discussions among each other, we don't see the like kind of support for communities around America where those Colombian drugs and Andean drugs end up. Any comment?
Well, I mean, as a citizen, I have a comment.
Let me hear that one. That's a step.
I'm very intimately involved with the problem of drug addiction and intimately aware, for a lot of reasons we can go into privately. And I know that we have to, it's not just a matter of shutting down the supply or the demand. We've got to get supply, demand, we've got to have education. Treatment on demand is somewhat controversial in some areas. I think treatment that leads to something and demands a performance is probably something that's...
I wouldn't have it any other way. Treatment on
good.
Demand that demands performance. Right. Well put. That's how it should be.
But in our part of this action is in the supply end, and we're trying to attack that and try to encourage people to have alternative crops and things of that nature. So
the money that this committee gives you is for alternative crops and putting people back in that, and you have some document that can show that money.
Spraying and other things that are involved, but it's all to reduce in one manner or another the supply of coca.
And so on the Colombian side, the people whose crops are now fumigated and they've been dislocated, the funds that this committee gives you guys, you use it to put those people and children back into their homes and other kinds of crops. They may grow cash crops and all.
Yeah, it's what we call alternative development, to give them other development schemes, whether it's other crops, et cetera. But it's not, as I said, we haven't been quite pleased with what's gone on in Colombia in that regard. And
you have a document that we can...
Yeah, I do, ma'am, and
Thank
I'll be glad to provide it. I just don't have it at my fingertips.
Thank you. I look forward to receiving it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Nolenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Armitage, again, thank you for your assistance here this morning and your responses. I know we've covered, or I've been told we've covered the India-Pakistan situation a little bit here.
Glad to talk about it, sir.
I have, as you know, to some extent it hasn't dropped off the radar screen, but it certainly is not as high as it was for good reasons. And a question that I have about these two countries, both of whom, as you know, have nuclear capabilities, really they're still locked in a standoff at the present time. You've got 1 million troops, I understand. If that's not correct, challenge me, but on the border, and that's a little bit of presence, I would say. So I think we have to keep our eyes on what is happening over there. The question I would have for you, and if you haven't answered this, if you have already, you can embellish maybe even further, but what is the administration doing to sustain the momentum in our relationship with India? I know, and I know why, of course, on the India-Pakistan money chase. there is some 145 million in the 02 bill that went to Pakistan. Obviously, there was none for India, and they're aware of that, I know, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, but it's a question I wanted to raise. Then for the 03 request, they bumped theirs from 145 million in Pakistan to 305 million, a sizable jump, which is substantially over what the India request is, which is 242. So what is the administration doing to sustain that relationship or the momentum in our relationship with India?
You know, there's a great irony. When Director Webster was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency in his last testimony before the U.S. Congress, he said that in his view, this was 12 years ago or so, in his view, the most dangerous, volatile situation in the world was on the India-Pakistan border, particularly regarding Kashmir. And I think that recent events, particularly from January on, have shown that he was right then and he's probably right now. The specter of two nations shouting and shooting and glaring at each other over a disputed territory is not exactly unknown, but when they're armed with nuclear weapons and they're having that kind of engagement, then there's a real bad recipe. The President, Secretary Powell particularly, Secretary Rumsfeld, have worked assiduously with both President Musharraf and most particularly with External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh to try to bring the level of terror, if you will, down on the border. And although the Indians are still in large measure forward deployed, some of the Pakistani units have, as I indicated earlier to the chairman, started to go back towards their western border or to more traditional locations. In terms of our relationship with India, the president laid this out at the Ronald Reagan Library before he was president, and said that one of his major endeavors was to have a relationship with the nation that is soon to be the largest nation in the world, soon surpass China. It is, as you correctly point out, a nuclear power, but it is not often pointed out, has the largest and fastest growing middle class in the world. Multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. Sounds pretty good. And we've sent Ambassador Bob Blackwell out there with pretty specific instructions about improving this relationship. We've had Prime Minister Vajpayee here. We've also had the opposition here. I had Sonia Gandhi in not long ago and discussed with her the opposition's views of the direction of India. And I think that you'll find that whether you're an American government official or an Indian government official, you're pretty confident that we're moving in a pretty new direction. We've recently, Mr. Lewis will be pleased, we've made some sales of defense equipment there that was reported in the press, which is relatively unprecedented for us. So.
The war on terrorism obviously has taken the focus away from perhaps what it was before. And the balance, obviously, between Pakistan and India is one that I'm sure the State Department is concerned about. I'm sure the President is concerned about as well.
What we're concerned about, sir, is if you look at South Asia, we've never had a balanced policy. We just haven't. And we had a policy, however, that I think people couldn't be confident on. For instance, our relationship during the 80s when things were great with Pakistan was not about Pakistan. It was about the war in Afghanistan. And so in a way, it was a false relationship. And what the president has tried to do is, both with India and Pakistan, have a relationship that's about them. Now, clearly, the war on terrorism gave us the entree now with Pakistan, but we're trying to be sincere with our Pakistani friends that we want a relationship that's about Pakistan. It's not about your relation with India or your relation with Afghanistan. It's about Pakistan. The same's true about India. It's not your relationship with China. It's India-U.S. that we want to concentrate on. And that seems to have some resonance.
Yep. Well, I appreciate that, and that's well said, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson.
I have some answers to Mr. Jackson's questions. If he wants more, I can provide them later.
Before I say anything, which would account against my 5 minutes, why don't you go ahead and pick up on other answers? Don't turn that thing upside down yet, Mr. Chairman. We'll wait for you, Mr. Armitage.
We made some calls while you were at
Thank you.
sir. There are 120,000.
You started my time. Go ahead, sir.
There are 120,000 American Israelis in Tel Aviv and 280 in Gaza, and we have 90,000 in Jerusalem, primarily in West Bank Palestinian Americans. And in partial answer to your question, what we did during the recent problems is, with the assistance of the Israeli Defense Force, we had organized a convoy out of the disputed areas to bring people, which our Consul General Ron Slichter and others took part in, to bring people who wanted to leave the areas where there was fighting out. But I still owe you more answers, and I'll provide those.
I appreciate that, Secretary Armitage. Mr. Lewis indicated that when he came to Congress in 1979, there were some significant discussions on both sides of the aisle about the territories. Representative Kilpatrick said she was entering the state legislature in 1979, and she was well aware of those debates as well in the state of Michigan, which has a very large Arab American population. In 1979, I was entering elementary school, or high school. I don't mean any harm. But I'm wondering, given that that's 25 years, and I've heard over the course of this debate that the occupation has been a 35-year proposition, I'm wondering, does the United States government see the occupation over the last, let's say, 25 or 35 years as a contributing factor in the present escalation?
I think, sir, we go back a lot sooner than 35 years ago to find contributing factors to, and I'm not being trite, to actually the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. Because to some extent, what you're seeing in that whole region is the aftershocks of the Ottoman Empire dissolution. That was 80 years ago, which has a different set of questions about the Soviet empire and other empires as they dissolve. How long do you feel aftershocks? Clearly, settlements, probably in the main, and occupation is a factor, but equally clear, a big factor even, but equally clearly a factor that Israelis take into consideration every day as they want to live a life in secure borders themselves. And I don't think the situation gives itself to simple answers. I'm not suggesting you or suggesting it does, but there are lots of factors.
But my question is specific about how the United States government views the occupation.
The government has successive governments have talked about settlement policy and occupation as with the reason we've engaged in so many negotiations and attempts to resolve the question as a broker. I'm not sure in a way that we can, as Ms. Kilpatrick suggested, be a completely honest broker. We're interested. We're not a disinterested party, but we're interested in fairness, but we're very interested in the survival of the State of Israel, too. But I think we're the only broker that can have any effect on this situation, and that's why everyone has encouraged us to jump in with both feet, and the President dispatched Secretary Powell to the region.
Mr. Secretary, 5 years ago, the Foreign Operations Subcommittee reached agreement for reductions of economic assistance to Egypt and Israel over a 10-year period. Egyptian and Israeli aid reductions were in a 3-to-2 ratio. Egyptian military assistance was to be maintained at a constant level. Israeli military assistance was to increase approximately $60 million a year. After 5 years, some members are suggesting that our understanding with the Egyptians should be changed. They suggest more economic assistance should be given and military assistance should be reduced. Would reducing military assistance to Egypt and increasing economic assistance be in the national interest of the United States?
I've had these discussions with Mr. Lantos and others, and I don't believe it would be at this time. I believe the best solution would be something that's arrived at mutually between Egypt and the United States. And I know that in our discussions with the Egyptians, this has not been something that they found favor with, sir.
Would reducing military assistance be a benefit to the U.S.-led war against terrorism?
I can't imagine that it would. I think it was, in a large measure, the fact that we had a robust military assistance to Egypt, that we were able to cooperate with them in the past, or 10 years ago, and we may be able to cooperate with them and interoperate with them in the future.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. My colleagues get to ask all these fun policy questions, so it's left to the chairman to ask these nitty-gritty questions about the bill itself. So I've got a couple of these kind of boring questions here for you, Mr. Chair or Mr. Secretary. One has to do with the fact that other than some of the monies to Afghanistan, all the funds in the supplemental request would expire at the end of the current fiscal year. Ms. Lowy touched on this. In other words, if they're not obligated, they're going to get returned to the Treasury. And certainly we expect, because it is labeled an emergency supplemental, it's going to get obligated as quickly as possible. And we want State Department and AID to do that, but we also want to ensure that important funds aren't going to be lost if funds are delayed. You know, we're not going to get this bill done at the very most optimistic until June, enacted into law, maybe July. Is that going to give you enough time to fully obligate all the funds you've requested? Does it make any sense not to extend the availability of these funds beyond the fiscal year, into fiscal year 2003?
OMB, sir, wanted to keep discipline in the administration, and that's why they put the very tight time constraint to make it clear that this, one, was an emergency supplemental, and two, we needed it now, and we couldn't wait till the completion of the 03, and that's why the time constraint. If the committee and the Congress in its wisdom saw fit to give a little flexibility, I think it would be great.
Well, it might be that not for all the accounts, but it might be that there are some that will need that, and as we get, and you'll know more of that as we get closer to the end of this process, and as we do in the conference, it would be useful for you to give us a list of those funds which may need to have the extension of time, so that we can
very much appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
do so. I would like ask you if you'd do that. And the other question that I wanted to ask has to do with the legal authorities that are involved here. There's throughout the bill, the language here, there's the phrase "notwithstanding any other provision of law," and we certainly are not trying to constrain the administration in its prosecution of the war against terrorism, but we also want to make sure that the authority is used appropriately. It's my understanding that the primary problem you face in obligating funds is the Brooke Amendment, the one that's contained in the Foreign Operations Act, and is a similar statement in the Foreign Assistance Act, and that is, I'm talking about the provision now that prohibits assistance for countries that are delinquent in their debt payments to the United States.
Afghanistan and Ethiopia, I think.
Afghanistan, Yemen, I believe.
Yemen, probably.
Ethiopia. If we limited the waiver provisions to this, to the Brooke Amendment, could the administration obligate funds consistent with its budget request?
I believe in Cote d'Ivoire there are also some, and I don't know the title of the law, but there are restrictions on coups. And the coup was some time ago. We're not able to move forward yet. And so at least in Cote d'Ivoire, I think we need a little help.
I think there's $2 million. Yeah, I was just looking myself here to see where we have Cote d'Ivoire. There's $2 million, yeah, border customs support.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think there's going to be a view on the part of, I shouldn't try to speak for Ms. Lowy, but I think on this subcommittee, to limit the waivers as much as possible. And if there are other places other than that Brooke Amendment that applies to the countries we just mentioned, it would be helpful if you could tell us where we would run afoul of being able to obligate these funds in other places.
It's very generous of you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Because I think otherwise you're going to find yourself with just not getting the waivers there. So
I appreciate it.
If you would do that, I'd appreciate it. The last question I'll ask has to do with and I'll have a couple more for the record here, but the last one I'll ask has to do with the Jordan here. A country that has been very supportive and given us a tremendous amount of help, and I think helpful at least, if not perhaps most, in the sense that they have not tried to inflame the situation in the Middle East. And I think that's been extremely important given the large number of Palestinians that live in Jordan. And so I think we should be very grateful to King Abdullah and his administration for the attempts that they have made to mediate peace in the region and to certainly counter the impact of the extremist elements. There's a request in this for $125 million, and then in the 2003 fiscal budget request has another $250 million through the ESF, $198 million in military assistance. I certainly support these requests, but I have concerns about what the rest of Western Europe and Asia is doing in their share to support Jordan. I think 15% of the budget for Jordan is allocated to international debt service. Much of that is held now by Western European countries, maybe some of it by Japan. We've forgiven most of our debt, I believe, over the years. Can you give me any indication that what is the status of Jordanian debt restructuring or forgiveness by Western European countries or Japan?
I cannot, and I will provide it for the record with your permission, sir.
I would appreciate that. Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to ask a question about Indonesia, but before I do, I'm sorry Mr. Jackson left, because I just wanted to make a very brief statement on the Middle East. And I think it's important to remember, if we're looking historically, that the Israeli people have been talking about peace, looking for peace, not since Oslo in 1993, as you well know, but for 54 years, since 1948, since the establishment of the Jewish state. And I think that's very important. And the Israeli people today, as you well know, are willing to give up land. They're willing to share in economic bounties. They're willing to share in technology. They really are focusing on normal relations. They want to bring about an end to the hostilities. They want to return to peace and security in the region. And I think it's important to remember, and I just happen to have a quote from David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, quote, 1948, "We offer peace and amity to all neighboring states and their peoples and invite them to cooperate with the Jewish nation for the common good of all. The state of Israel is ready to contribute its full share to the peaceful progress and reconstitution of the Middle East." They've been ready for peace for a long time, and I do hope that with the good efforts of this administration, and I would say all the parties in the region, I do hope we're putting sufficient pressure on the Saudis, on the Egyptians, to stand up and work for a negotiated settlement to bring peace to the region. I don't know whether Arafat wants peace, could make peace, can make an arrangement. I don't know. He gave up a pretty good deal that Barack offered him last time around. But I do know that unless the Egyptians and the Saudis and the Jordanians are willing to stand up and support a settlement that is leveraged by the United States, I worry about the future of that region.
Because the administration agrees with you that we do think the people of Israel are willing to give up land for peace. It's the basis of 242, 338, and successive Israeli governments have embraced that we continue this search. Thank God for Harry Truman.
And I thank you for your efforts. Quickly, with regard to Indonesia, I've indicated before the $8 million requested in the peacekeeping account for Indonesia amounts to military assistance, in my judgment, under a different name, and circumvents the certification standards of Section 572 of the FY 2002 bill. Number one, can you explain why this request is justified, and what is the status of your ability to certify the conditions of Section 572? And how would the provision of the $8 million affect ongoing efforts to obtain the compliance of the Indonesians on the conditions of Section 572, particularly bringing justice to members of the armed forces or militia groups for human rights violation for East Timor? And lastly, rebuilding efforts in East Timor have stalled. There will be a financing gap between known pledges and upcoming needs. In light of East Timor's obvious progress on the road to democracy and stability, why is there no request for East Timor in this package? And I just want to conclude that by saying, for those of us who've been very concerned about human rights violations in East Timor and shared their joy in the election of, of their new president, I'd be very appreciative of your responses to these questions.
Yes, ma'am. On the $8 million for the what we decided is indigenous internal, but there's a term of art we used. There was no intent to evade legislation. We believe that in places like West Irian Jaya, Aceh, there have been sectarian violence episodes. There's real possibilities of further sectarian violence. That we would love to have a trained police force with some civil affairs people that would be able to fall in on these and take care of internal peacekeeping, and that was our thinking on this. We are very aware of the human rights abuses of the Indonesian armed forces, and to my understanding, there was no desire to evade that. It's only a desire to not let sectarian violence in those places get out of hand. It's a specter that we can't we can't stand. We share your joy at the selection of Ismail, his 90% win or so in the elections. The reason that Timor is not in this is we didn't consider that part of an emergency supplemental, and particularly in the global war on terrorism. That does not mean to say that after the investment the international community and the United States has put into Timor, that we're going to turn away from it. That is not the case.
I would hope that we can have further discussions, because certainly if we can put in dollars for the military in Indonesia, I think we should consider funds to provide some stability and important assistance to the good people of East Timor who've been through an awful lot in the last years.
This is very true, but we are really worried that places that have sectarian violence, if I can finish the thought in Indonesia, it can become the breeding ground. Indonesia is a tough problem for governance, being 14 to 17,000 islands. No one gives me a correct total. Far-flung locations. It's a tough problem that President Megawati has taken on. It's an open, very hospitable country, and it's a Muslim country. It's one we fear that Al-Qaeda could operate in relatively freely. Just by the way, like Al-Qaeda operates until recently relatively freely in our own, because we're a hospitable, open country. So to have that openness combined with the sectarian violence is a fearful specter for us. That's why we're trying to come up with some way to train some internal peacekeepers.
I'm going to conclude and submit my other questions for the record, but I also want to conclude by thanking you for your direct responses, your openness. It is a delight dealing with you. You're always there to discuss any issue, and you are appreciated, in case you didn't know it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, earlier I briefly mentioned that my job and the place involves another subcommittee largely.
Right.
In the Defense Subcommittee, we will probably mark up the President's request of some $379 billion for the 03 year. I think the public should note with interest that you were here speaking on behalf of a 03 package as well as the supplement, but the 03 package at a level of $16.136 billion. The defense package being 25 times that amount, and yet the role that foreign assistance plays in our ability to impact the world for peace cannot be discounted. Our publics, our members' publics, presume that we spend half our budget on foreign aid of some kind, oftentimes, I mean. It's really important for the public to understand that, and as other members have suggested, you certainly do credit the institution that is our State Department, as well as our efforts at foreign policy by way of the way you deal with this committee and others. So I appreciate that very swirls
I'm humbled by your comment. Thank you.
Back to Colombia just briefly.
Sure.
The Plan Colombia swirls around our concern about Colombia as a source of drugs impacting our country. That's a significant piece of our committee's interaction currently. Colombia is known as the world's kidnapping capital. I'm not sure if our public really understands the why of that. Could you kind of outline for me, maybe the committee, the numbers of kidnappings we've had, what we've done about that, what success we've had, et cetera?
Well, part of our request, Mr. Lewis, gets right at the anti-kidnap training, kidnap prevention, et cetera. We've had a presidential candidate, Betancourt, recently kidnapped. I described Mr. Uribe's recent escape from an assassination attempt. There have been 12 of those. There have been kidnap attempts as well. Some of this is a business where people are kidnapped for ransom. Others are political business where they're kidnapped to try to force a political change. It's a growing concern. It's why we specifically address kidnapping in our request for the supplemental, sir. I don't have figures on it. They're pretty, I'm sure, readily obtainable, but it's a horrible problem. 3,000 in 2001, Mr. Boabin.
Is that right? Yeah. Well, to say the least, that challenge complicates our difficulty in all of our work in Latin America.
Yes, sir.
Some 50 years ago, there was a textbook around that was entitled Wanted an Asian Policy, and within one chapter in that, there was a discussion of India, suggesting that as India goes, so may very well go Asia, and perhaps our hope for peace in the world. I must say your comments earlier and that which I know of changing policy there. I couldn't be more pleased with the raising of priority and new directions that are taking place, specifically in that country, India. Mr. Chairman, you've been more than helpful with your time and recognition. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Your questions have been very much to the point and very helpful to this hearing today. Mr. Secretary, I would echo the words of my good friend and ranking member, Ms. Lowy, in saying we really appreciate your appearance here today, and we appreciate the directness of the answers that you've given. It's very refreshing to get a government official, especially a diplomat, to come up and say, I really don't know the answer to that, or, gee, that may not be a good policy answer. It's a political reason that we do this. It's very refreshing to hear that, and we appreciate very much the directness and honesty of the answers that you've given us. I think it's been very helpful to us. With that, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Are you coming back? She doesn't want to. She does not want to rub elbows with me. Now that we share that wall, that's enough contact.
Really? What we got against Red? I lived on the other side of it.
Somebody's going to yell at you.
I got it. We're going to have a meeting here for a few minutes. What'd you learn? Well, he's actually great. Tends to be on the phone just so
Thank you. One for John. John.